Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show, where we help you make the wisest and most profitable decisions. My name is Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. I'm the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, the future of work consultancy that sponsors the Wise Decision Maker Show. And I'm joined today by Alex. Alex, can you please share a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Thank you so much, Dr. Gleb. My name is Alex Alonso. I'm an organizational psychologist. My background, my doctorate's in organizational psychology, and I am the Chief Data and Analytics Officer for the Society for Human Resource Management, or SHRM, leading our thought leadership and our business intelligence functions, and playing a key role in understanding how it is that employers are leveraging not just artificial intelligence, but generative AI intelligence.
So let's talk a little bit about that. The big explosion of generative AI has been in November 2022 when ChatGPT was first pushed out and people started using it. I don't know if you saw any adoption of it beforehand, but let's talk about what you've seen, especially afterward, and all the subsequent nearly 3 years since this technology was out. How have people been using it from the early days up to now?
So it's kind of funny. We've actually seen and you're referencing obviously the big announcement back in 2022, or the end of 2022, that led to what was the birth of or the launch of ChatGPT, right? One of the things that strikes me in particular is when it comes to generative AI, we see that there are actually waves of adoption, right? And when we look and ask American workers, employers, what it is that they're experiencing, they actually have hit a big boom after that 2022 date, right? We
Mhm.
saw that, for instance, ChatGPT had 1 million users within 5 days, right? It was the fastest ever at that point in terms of any kind of application that had that much adoption. What we found though was that people were using it and really testing and trying in that first big boom, right? In the second wave that happened really the second half of 2023, we saw a
Mhm.
little bit of a lull in how people were using it. They had kind of grown accustomed to it and were really waiting for that 4.0 and other
Mhm.
generative AI tools to come out. And what we saw was that second wave that was people adopting generative AI, ChatGPT being the most common tool that they were using.
Mhm.
But then beyond that, we saw a second layer that was limited language models, right? So large language models that were limited in terms of the
Mhm.
data that they were able to reference, and that people were using them for specific use cases. And that
Mhm.
was the second boom that we saw. What we got out of that, if you were to look at our data, is we saw that in HR, there were five key areas where people or organizations were using this. The
Mhm.
first was really around talent acquisition. The biggest
Mhm.
area that people did used generative AI was around talent acquisition. About 40% of
Mhm.
employers at that point, or about 42% of them, said that
Mhm.
they're using it for job descriptions. They were using it to
Mhm.
kind of identify how it is that they screen talent. They were using it to identify what was new novel compensation
Mhm.
plans that they could offer or put into market, changing the way that they do job ads, that kind of thinking, right? What we saw though then was that there were other things like learning and development. What are the kind of learning
Mhm.
exercises that I can give people? What is the kind of leadership development exercise that I can offer my leaders within the organization? And there was about 38% of employers who were doing that.
Mhm.
At the same time, then we saw growth in other areas like onboarding, things that had to do
Mhm.
specifically with benefits administration, compensation and
Mhm.
total rewards, and doing auditing and so on.
Mhm.
We then hit a lull again in
Mhm.
2024 because people sort of started to use these tools from an HR perspective that were predominantly focused on these kind of core areas, but there wasn't an
Mhm.
expansion in the technology as we
Mhm.
saw. It wasn't until the birth of agents and really the launch of agents based upon generative AI and large
Mhm.
language models that we then started to see specifically the next wave, that third
Mhm.
wave, which has really carried us from the fourth quarter of 2024 into the beginning of 2025 here. Now,
Mhm.
that's how employers are using it in the context
Mhm.
of employee experience. What's fascinating is, though, at the same time, we saw that many workers themselves were actually also ramping up their adoption, but doing it in a way
Mhm.
not as typically expected, right? Generative AI, for the most people, when you think of generative AI, you're thinking about generating creation, doing something
Mhm.
that is
Mhm.
new,
Mhm.
novel, different, right? I think of Stephen Thaler and some of his works, some of the cases he's doing where he's working predominantly on patents and ideas and copyright and how AI can actually be
Mhm.
an inventor's tool, right? What I
Yeah.
find, and obviously his platform is Dabus, that's the most famous one that is for inventors. What we see is there is a sort of different application when it comes to your average user. And that's
Hmm.
largely because the average user, if you look at the average user, whether it's about 22% who say they have almost no experience using AI or generative AI,
Hmm.
or the 63% who classify themselves as beginners, meaning they've only used it
Hmm.
in really limited cases, what we realize is that big swath of workers are using it more for optimization or enhancement purposes
Hmm.
than for um, what is true generation and creation. Case in
Hmm.
point, right? I'll share with you. We did a look at specific roles, specific jobs. You
Hmm.
ask marketers, the majority of them are using a generative AI today, not for creating brand campaigns, not for creating new
Hmm.
content, not for creating new pieces of art
Hmm.
that would go with or design art that would go with their campaigns. What they're using it for, in most cases, is to edit copy and
Hmm.
really make their copy more effective, more pitchy, more pithy, all the kinds of things that you would expect, right? That's optimization or
Hmm.
enhancement. That is not the piece that we think about when we think about the true purpose of generative
Hmm.
AI, which is help me design a campaign that's going to hit these
Sure.
targets and from soup to nuts, give me decisions I need to make, ways that I need to approach things, and really driving those things. We still see that that is a
Hmm.
particular limitation, if you will, that people are still using it for
Hmm.
narrow purpose as opposed to the broad purpose.
Now, one of the asks for HR, so I've worked with a number of companies to figure out generative AI adoptions, and one of the big asks for HR, unlike for other IT projects, is to encourage people to use generative AI effectively. And of course, it's a different technology than other IT projects because people have a lot of anxiety around it. They have a lot of anxiety about job loss, about job disruption, which is one of the reasons people tend to use it in a limited fashion. And there's also the other side of it that the people need to use it to discover use cases that are applicable to them and their roles in a way that you wouldn't with a typical digital transformation project like an ERP or a CRM database. And so you have both of those dynamics. People are afraid of using it, and they also need to use it much more extensively to leverage the most effective usage out of it. So when HR is kind of put in that position where it's not typically a digital transformation project of both using it themselves and getting employees to use it extensively, how should HR start to think about its role in generative AI adoption?
When I think specifically about this, there's always the key response that we've seen from a variety of different
Hmm.
leaders and kind of thought leaders in this space, right? It's that HR is responsible for the human adoption component of this, right?
Yeah.
And really the change management that goes with
Yeah.
that. Any solid transformation rests on change management and really
Hmm.
helping people become go from what might be a potential laggard to an early adopter or an
Hmm.
adopter along the way. What we found in this case, though, and I'll share this, is that it's really about the adage of thinking specifically about, okay,
Hmm.
we all have the concept of displacement. We all know that there is, if you believe some estimates in terms of BLS data, there's about 19.1 million jobs currently that are
Hmm.
on that short path to displacement, right? There's by short path, I mean sometime in the next 5 years. What
Yeah.
we see in particular, though, is if you manage that displacement and manage ways to ensure that that those expectations are not what people are leading with immediately,
Hmm.
that is really the first hurdle that any organization has to engage in, right? And so
Hmm.
the easiest way that that happens, in having met with and interviewed people who have been either potential subjects of displacement or potential subjects of replacement, what we
Hmm.
found is the tactic that works best when it's comes to the people leaders and the human resource management function is actually helping arm people or engage in what I call upscaling. In other words,
Hmm.
giving people skills that are new skills, but
Hmm.
making sure that it's skills that are leveraged in the use of generative AI for specific
Hmm.
use cases that are monetizable, compensable use cases,
Hmm.
right? And so making that point that you are
Hmm.
continuously engaging in upscaling and helping people understand how their skills are transitioning to not
Hmm.
a AI displacement, but rather an AI plus HI replacement. And what I
Hmm.
mean by that is think about it in this perspective, right? People, I
Hmm.
get asked this question all the time. Is HR going to be displaced by AI? Are we going to be replaced by AI?
Hmm.
And the answer I give people is today, there is no evidence that that is going to happen within the next 10 years.
Hmm.
However, what I can tell you is the HR professional who is proficient in using AI is
Hmm.
going to displace you tomorrow, right?
Hmm.
Because that person who is well armed, well educated, and
Hmm.
understands specifically what it is that they need to use these tools for and understands the use cases
Hmm.
where it might be used can easily unlock a little equation that I like to think of, and pardon the pun here, but it's taking AI agentry to unlock human agency. And I think
Hmm.
that is that equation that needs to
Hmm.
happen, and only the HR function can do that.
So one difficulty with this is, and I've heard this from a number of focus groups, where people are in their 50s, maybe early 60s, people who are very experienced and highly respected for what they're doing right now. A lot of them feel that, hey, AI will enable people who are just starting their careers to do the same thing that I do. They're essentially putting me back at that level, and maybe I can't even pick it up as quickly as someone who has been in the job for a year or two because they're much more technologically savvy. So it's kind of challenging the existing status hierarchies and power dynamics, whether it's within HR or outside of HR, within marketing, within other areas that are strongly vulnerable to AI disruption. So what do you tell people about around these ego issues, around this displacement of hierarchies, of people who have to go back to nearly the beginning, maybe even backward, maybe even further than that, because they're not as comfortable with technology as the youngins are.
So it's fascinating. We see our data, for instance, baby boomers and traditionalists are almost two times as likely, or at least 50% more likely to say that they are more beginner and nervous about their
Hmm.
understanding of AI, right? There's no question about that. What is particularly telling about it, though, is I use a strategy that is twofold. One is
Hmm.
to remind people that there is consistent change that happens with technology, and that those
Hmm.
technologies are designed to unlock potential for all groups, right? And I use a couple different examples that stand out to me in
Hmm.
terms of what it is where I've seen
Hmm.
specifically knowledge transfer being a part of what it is that is critical, and
Hmm.
older generations or aging workers are the ones that actually have deeper knowledge that can impart that in many ways, right?
Hmm.
That piece is not lost, whether it's an artificial
Hmm.
intelligence agent or a human person that you're conveying that to. The other thing
Hmm.
that I highlight is the thing that many people aren't considering is the amount of work that is also being generated as a function of generative AI. And I ask
Hmm.
people to consider specifically, look at all the new roles that are born out there that are
Hmm.
existing today that didn't exist a year ago as a
Hmm.
result of generative AI. And what are the
Hmm.
types of roles that allow you to actually not only inform how those roles are performed, but more
Hmm.
importantly, give you an opportunity to take on those roles. And I'll give an example, right?
Hmm.
One of the ones that I see popping up left and right is AI ethicist, right?
Hmm.
And it's actually somebody who is thinking broadly about the ethics related to AI. Because
Hmm.
AI is such a new phenomenon, there is no
Hmm.
one out there who has a key component of or a key thought around what the ethics are. They're still being defined
Hmm.
as we go, right? Knowledge and depth and experience can contribute to that kind of dialogue,
Hmm.
that kind of logging of different perspectives or different
Hmm.
kind of ethical quandaries, right? And so those are the kinds of things that actually an
Hmm.
aging worker might have an advantage over a younger
Hmm.
worker. The other thing I think about, and I share this in large part with many of my research partners, is when you look at specifically communication styles, right? We
Mhm.
know that a lot of large language models are based upon natural language processing or have interfaces that allow for natural language processing. That's great. But when it comes to teaching the algorithm and understanding specifically how
Mhm.
algorithms adopt new thinking and adopt different kind of
Mhm.
prompting and those things, you need somebody who's actually adept at communication in various ways and probably a better writer than folks who aren't.
Mhm.
This is again an advantage where an older worker might have better
Mhm.
communication skills, whether it be through writing, whether it be through communication, than
Mhm.
someone who is new, right? Again, you're expanding the learning that can happen with a machine learning component or an algorithm.
Mhm.
So I look at that and say to myself, there are opportunities there. You just have to remove the frame that is
Mhm.
the hierarchical component, right? It's how do I
Mhm.
go about doing something, but understanding that I'm going to be doing something with this new partner in my workplace, and that partner is AI.
Mhm. Now, I want to ask a question that we've kind of talked about a little bit, but I want to get a little bit more concretely. Namely, what is the difference in the change management process of adopting AI versus other change management processes? Because we've talked about, like right now, with let's say AI ethics. That's not something you talk about when you implement a new ERP or a new CRM, right? Oh, so that's a distinction. And then another distinction I kind of mentioned earlier is that you need to develop use cases specific to your role, that it's easy to use it for optimizing, but there are so many better use cases for innovation and so on. And they depend on individuals to really have a lot of buy-in into AI and using it extensively. So what are the differences between adopting generative AI as a change management process versus adopting any other technology?
So what I always think about is there's a couple things that stand out, right? Like with any other
Mhm.
change management process, you do set up policies around use, you set up policies around data governance and what have you, right? But these in particular are really different in the way that you approach this because many of them are open source, right? And some of the tools
Mhm.
that you're dealing with are very much open source. So there is a not just a cybersecurity issue, but rather the notion of
Mhm.
what this means if you are uploading content, if you are
Mhm.
uploading data and expecting an analysis, but at the same time also driving some of your information out there to be shared
Mhm.
randomly with other groups, right? The other thing that I think that stands out is to understand the use cases where large language models in their broadest form are most effective, right?
Mhm.
And so if we're talking about creative activities and we're talking about creative analyses,
Mhm.
those are the kinds of things where you're going to see the randomness of a large
Mhm.
language model actually be powerful, be
Mhm.
very meaningful, right? However, if you're in a business where those things are not a requirement, you need consistency and you need
Mhm.
different approaches. Now you're living in a world where you have to have a limited large language model, right? And
Mhm.
limiting what the base is and those kinds of tools. Those are the things that are different and different from
Mhm.
the kind of behavior that we've tried to teach in years past when adopting something, right?
Mhm.
Because now we're actually parsing apart use cases, rules, different ways of approaching specific things, and assuming that everybody has to learn how to do these things
Mhm.
with what could be any number of different
Mhm.
use cases, right? I can think specifically about one partner that we have here who has 70,000 use cases simply in the world of design and marketing
Mhm.
and the various prompts that go with that, right?
Mhm.
Now, in thinking about that, that is now a case where I'm trying to provide my arms around and try to say this is a unique kind of transformation process that applies to everybody within an organization, but at the same time is targeted to specific use cases within specific disciplines. That becomes very tricky. That is now
Mhm.
a fractured kind of transformation effort that really does make it difficult for there to be a one size fits all approach. That to me is where I see real kind of different uh, components of a transformation
Mhm.
effort with generative AI as opposed to other technologies, right? Typically, when
Mhm.
you're going to change to an ERP or you're going to change to a CRM or you're going to do this, you think about all the use cases, but you put it under that one umbrella.
Mhm.
This is a much more fragmented approach because you're using the platform of generative AI as a concept, and you may have so many different applications and use
Mm,
cases out there that to try to wrap your arms around all of them is particularly difficult. And
mhm,
to try to educate people and provide them with the upskilling they need to do those
mhm,
things could be particularly difficult as well. Forget the security issues, right? And so all of a sudden, now you're talking about a much more fragmented transformation
mm,
that makes it hard for people to actually be effective.
mhm. Now, key part of any transformation process is employee engagement. So, what are the best tactics for employee engagement within generative AI? Maybe some distinctions and some similarities to how you do other change management projects.
So the best thing that I've seen with generative AI in particular, the best two tactics that I've seen is communal learning. And what I
Mhm,
mean by that is two different approaches. First and foremost is giving people the opportunity to have a forum where they can share ideas and share code,
mm,
share prompting, share anything that they're engaged in doing, which is very common, but it is something that many organizations are moving to as a
mhm,
forum where they can do that. The other thing that I think is particularly interesting, and I've seen happen in a variety of organizations, is have AI learning days. So full days where
mm,
people can engage in, we're going to learn about this platform and we're going
mhm,
to learn about specific use cases depending upon who we are. And the entire organization shuts
mhm,
down and does that for that day. So that you're
mhm,
giving real priority to what it is that people are doing and actually giving that large language model or that generative AI the opportunity to really permeate across several different groups.
mhm,
That's one. The second one, and I can't take credit for this, is from a gentleman that we've worked with here at SHRM on CEO Academy. His name is Ethan Mollick from the Wharton School, and
mhm,
Ethan, very well known in this space, he talks about what he's seen that was really creative with generative AI is seeing organizations start to incentivize ideation with it, right?
mhm,
The idea being that you create sort of an X prize incentive for your workforce, depending upon how big your organization is. If somebody comes up
mhm,
with what is eventually $1 billion idea, they get to have an equivalent of a cash prize for having developed that
mhm,
using generative AI, right? And so he's reported out a couple times where he's seen that actually be something that is a true motivator for the workforce and
mhm.
gives them the opportunity to kind of weigh in different parts of the organization.
Excellent. Now, as we finish up, what are you seeing as the future of generative AI and HR within the next couple of years?
As far as generative AI and HR is concerned, there are some interesting things that we're starting to see.
Hmm,
We're starting to see the notion of deepfakes actually being a positive thing
hmm,
as opposed to a negative thing. So we're starting to see deepfakes take hold in onboarding exercises, take
hmm,
hold in learning and development. So imagine receiving training from a deepfake that is having it be personalized, but could be your CEO or could be
hmm,
your CHRO offering that learning.
hmm,
Imagine we're also starting to see scenarios whereby organizations are building out a repository of various prompting libraries,
hmm,
prompting that allows them to really kind of take advantage of
hmm,
the large language models that they've built out themselves or that they're leveraging externally. So we're starting to see that really pop up. And then I think the other thing that is inevitable is I think we're going to see a scenario where we start to see chief intelligence officers as
hmm,
opposed to chief human resource officers, meaning that your chief human resource officer may end up being the person who's responsible for both the artificial intelligence in your
hmm,
organization and the human intelligence and making sure that we get
hmm.
output and productivity from the combination of the two.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Alex. This was super helpful. Really appreciate your expertise.
Thank you, Gleb. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on with you.
And thank you to the audience for checking out another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show. Please make sure to subscribe wherever you checked out the show and leave a review. It helps others discover the show and helps us improve the show. And if you have any questions, email me at gleb, Gleb, at disasteravoidanceexperts.com.